Did anyone understand what those signs said? In many different languages, they mean, do you understand? Learning different languages is important to communicate with people from all over the world. Today, we are going to talk about multilingualism and its importance, and also translation and interpretation. This intercultural communication in context textbook says that multilingualism is the ability to communicate in at least two languages fluently or at least competently. So why is it important to learn more than one language? One reason is to communicate with others. No matter where you are in the world, you will always run into someone that needs to speak a different language or knows a different language that's not yours. If you run into one of these people, there are two approaches you could take. One is hope the person knows your language, or two, know the person's language. But why is it important to know someone else's language? Well, a quote from Nelson Mandela says, "If you talk to a man in a language he understands, it goes to his head. But if you talk to a man in his own language, that goes to his heart." So this quote goes to mean that if you talk to someone in their own language, they'll appreciate it more, and also it's just a simple act of kindness to give someone. Another reason to learn another person's language, understand a different culture. Language is a huge part of culture. A quote from Flora Lewis says, "Learning a new language is not only learning words for the same thing, learning another way to think about things." This shows that people see the world differently depending on what language they speak. To understand other humans, we have to learn how they communicate. As the intercultural communication textbook says, as we have described it, language and culture is so intricately entwined that to learn a new language is to gain insight into another culture and into another world. Sure, we learn about different cultures all the time, but to actually know how they communicate and what language they speak is a big part of that, because without words or ideas of things, no one would be able to communicate. And the last reason why someone should learn a new language is because of travel. So many people want to travel in the world, but like in this video, I'm speaking English, and people think that English can be spoken all over the world and understood. While that may be true, it would be, as stated before, the kind and courteous thing to do to learn another language before you go. Not only will that make you seem like a better human, some people say, well, why don't we just have an interpreter or use an app that will translate for us? Well, one, those apps don't always work correctly. And two, you'll just gain so much more knowledge by learning a different language. And with interpretation, you have to actually know how much work goes into that. So we will start the topic of interpretation and then translation. The Intercultural Communication textbook defines interpretation as the process of verbally expressing what is said or written in another language. It defines translation as the process of producing a written text that refers to something said or written in another language. Many people don't know the difference between interpretation and translation. So interpretation is verbal. One person says it to another, and we'll go into more of the specific types of interpretation. And translation is a written text into a written text. So we're going to go over 3 different types of interpretation. The first type is simultaneous interpretation. This is when a person speaks, and as soon as they speak, an interpreter will say the words right after them. Consecutive interpretation is when there's a speaker, and then they finish, and then the interpreter will say what they just said. And then sight translation is when an interpreter piece of paper, and they're reading what's on that paper, but it's in a different language, and then they say it in a different language. So here I have some books that are translated into Spanish. For example, La Agora Muy Hambriante, which is the very hungry caterpillar. Another example is Buenas noches, Gorilla. These are really cool. So this book, in otras palabras, says 5 things about translation. And the first idea says, translation counterbalances dependence on circumlocution. The next one is just a good one in general. It says, translation requires attention to detail. This is great in life because everything requires attention. But when you're translating something, not only do you have to look at a single word, you have to look at a whole phrase. The next one says, translation capitalizes on learners' knowledge of their own language. This is very true. Once you learn a second language, you have so much more grammar concepts that you can apply to your native language. Quotes to back this up. Johann Wolfgang van Goethe, which says, those who know nothing of a foreign language know nothing of their own. This is so important because without language or communication, none of us would be here. We would just be bumps on a log doing nothing. The second to last point from the Otras Palabras books. Translation is a cultural as well as linguistic activity. So communication in context puts a beautiful quote that says, translation is more than merely switching languages. It involves negotiating cultures. And it's not only just learning a new language, but if you learn a new language, there are multiple different types of that language. For example, like Spanish, there's Spain Spanish, Central American Spanish, Mexican Spanish, and they all have different words to mean the same thing. And the last point from that book says, translation is fun. And this is so true. It's like a game to pick which word goes into what context. To review, today we talked about the importance of multilingualism and how it relates with different cultures. And then we talked about the differences of interpretation and translation. Thank you very much.